What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So to start off, my first pro for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is the software. Now with this phone, we are getting Android 13, and it did come with it, so definitely nice to get the latest version of Android. And while on one hand at this point in 2023, having Android 13 is pretty much an expectation, there are still plenty of phones that don't for whatever reason. And in addition to this, Samsung really has some of the best software support when it comes to Android phones. So with this phone, you can also expect to get several other major updates in the future. Since again, it does originally come with Android 13, it also will be getting 14, 15, 16, and 17. So in general, if the software is important to you and maybe you want to keep your phone for a few years, then for a phone in this price range, the A34 5G is really one of the best options. My second pro for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is the processor. With this phone, we're getting 6GB of RAM, with the MediaTek Dimensity 1080 processor. Now the performance on this phone is actually really good, and despite being a really affordable phone going for around $327 factory unlocked, at least in the US, I feel like it might be a little bit less or a little bit more depending on where you are. But yeah, in general, this is a really affordable phone, and despite this, the performance is actually really good. Now, depending on your expectations, this may or may not be your experience. If you're coming from like a Samsung Galaxy S10, or maybe you're trying to decide between this phone and something like a Google Pixel 6a or a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE, or even an iPhone SE, while being fast for a mid-range phone, the A34 5G is not going to be anywhere near as fast as those entry-level flagship phones. So if that is really your expectation, then yeah, you will be a little disappointed. But honestly, for most people, for things people typically use smartphones for, like social media, web browsing, streaming content like videos and music, and even a decent amount of mobile gaming and stuff like that, it will get the job done just fine. And yeah, again, if you're on your phone a lot doing more demanding activities, then you might want to get something a bit faster. But in general, if you are looking for a mid-range phone and you have a rough idea of what mid-range phone performance is really like, then I do think you will be happy with this phone. Now, I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise compared to your current device. Because of course, depending on what you currently have, it may or may not actually be a performance upgrade. If you're coming from maybe an older flagship phone, then yeah, I feel like for the most part, it's probably not going to be an upgrade. But if you're coming from, say, a Samsung Galaxy A33 5G, then in that case, I do think this will be a pretty solid upgrade. But overall, for what it is, I am pretty impressed with this phone's performance. My third pro for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is the battery. Now with this phone, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 25W fast charging, so really in every way, this is a great battery. With 25W fast charging, sure, compared to some phones that have like 30 or 50W fast charging, not that any of those are really going to be in this price range, but if that's really your expectation, then you might be a little disappointed. But honestly, for this price range, 25W fast charging is pretty good, and in my experience, the charging speeds are definitely acceptable. That being said though, keep in mind, the A34 5G does not actually have a wall adapter, and in order to actually utilize the 25W fast charging, you will actually need a 25W fast charger. So if you don't have one, you will have to get one. But aside from the charging, with the 5000 mAh battery, you can expect to get some great battery life and longevity here. So if you're in a situation where you have to use your phone all day and maybe you don't get a lot of time to charge it, in that case, the A34 5G will be a great choice for you. My fourth pro for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is the display. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.6-inch 120Hz Super AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 390, and a 19.5:9 aspect ratio. So the display here is good in pretty much every way. With the 1080p resolution, of course, we're getting a nice sharp image. So if you're doing stuff like watching videos where you want things to look real nice and crisp, you will get a good experience here. The Super AMOLED gives us nice colors, good brightness, and the viewing angles are pretty good too. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, the phone is still going to be pretty easy to see. With a 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is a little bit faster and smoother, making the phone feel a bit more premium in general. And when it comes to size and dimensions, at 6.6 inches, the display is definitely on the larger side. So if you're going to be on your phone a bit more, definitely a good thing. And with the 19.5:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a decently tall and narrow form factor here. Maybe not the tallest and most narrow I've ever seen, but I feel like that's not really necessarily objectively a good or bad thing. But regardless, I do think it looks good on this phone. If you're doing something like browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, you will get a pretty nice scrolling experience. And if you're doing something in landscape mode, like playing a game, watching videos, looking at photos, with a nice tall narrow form factor like this, you will get a pretty pretty immersive experience and things are going to look pretty good in general. So overall, if you're looking for a more affordable phone that has a nice display, you're definitely not going to go wrong with this phone. And then finally, my 5th pro for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is the camera. Now with this phone, up front, we got a 13 megapixel selfie camera, then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera, and a 5 megapixel macro camera. And then for video, this phone can record in up to 4K in both the rear and front cameras, so definitely nice there. So overall, realistically, there's really nothing wrong with this camera. It has pretty much all the features you typically find in a mid-range phone, including an ultra wide camera and a macro camera. Now, it's not perfect, and we will get to that later, but in general, for typical mid-range kind of expectations, with this camera setup, I feel like there's really nothing else I could ask for. And in addition to having a good amount of features, the photo quality is real good too. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the A34 5G, and yeah, definitely great quality here. Now, of course, this is at least somewhat subjective because if you're coming from like an older flagship phone like a Samsung Galaxy S10 or an iPhone XS Max. I say that because I used to have an iPhone XS Max and it did have a surprisingly good camera, but in general, coming from a phone like that, the photo quality with the A34 is not going to be nearly as good, but compared to your average $300 or so phone, the photo quality here is actually pretty impressive, and honestly for the average user, you're probably not going to need any better than this. If you're really just posting the occasional Instagram photo every now and then, you definitely don't need to spend $1,000 on a flagship phone for that. So overall, for average daily use, I would say the camera setup we get with this phone is definitely plenty good enough. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some of the not so good things. So my first con for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is that it doesn't have a headphone jack. Now this is really too bad because I guess I understand when it comes to higher end phones, we haven't seen a headphone jack in a flagship phone for years now. But at the same time, this is not a flagship phone, this is really a budget phone, going for again around $327 factory unlocked. And I feel like when it comes to a device like this, it really just doesn't make sense to take away the headphone jack. I mean, plenty of people out there, despite wireless headphones being more or less the standard now, are still using normal wired headphones. So in that case, if that's you, sure, you can technically still use them on this phone if you get an adapter, but that's definitely not the most convenient thing to have to do. So in general, seeing that this phone doesn't have a headphone jack is definitely disappointing. My second con for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is that it doesn't support HDMI out. Now this might not sound like a big deal, and honestly for a lot of people it might never be, but at the same time in certain situations, like say you're in a hotel room for example, and you want to connect your phone to the TV and watch a YouTube video, more likely than not the hotel room is probably going to have an older TV that doesn't support screencasting, and in that situation it would be nice to plug an HDMI cable into an adapter and then just put it in the phone and have it connect that way. But unfortunately, again, even if you do have an adapter, HDMI out doesn't work on this phone, and neither does Samsung DeX, so you can't connect this phone to a computer monitor either. Now again, for a lot of people this might not even be something you ever think about, but at the same time, if you're coming from a higher end device and you're used to these features, then it still might be a little disappointing. My third con for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is the camera notch. Now what I mean by this is, as you can see here, the selfie camera does have a water drop notch instead of a hole punch, and while this may not seem like a big deal, honestly it's really not. It is purely aesthetic, but at the same time, seeing that the rest of the phone has a nice modern, kind of premium design, it is really too bad that it has kind of this outdated look, especially considering lots of phones like mid-range Motorola phones for example, and even other Samsung phones for that matter, all are starting to get hole punches, and seeing as this phone, despite being more of an affordable option, is definitely not really a low-end phone per se, it would have been nice to see a better looking design for the selfie camera. But again, this is really an aesthetic kind of thing, and maybe you actually like this look, so in general, it's really up to personal preference, but I feel like when it comes to this, they definitely could have done better. Now my fourth con for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is that it doesn't have wireless charging. Now this is another one of those things that, on one hand, if you kind of know what to expect with a phone like this may not be a surprise and probably won't be a big deal to you. But if you're coming from an older device that does have wireless charging but maybe is a bit higher end, and you're expecting every phone at this point in 2023 to have wireless charging, just keep in mind unfortunately that's not the case, and in this day and age, wireless charging is still more of a feature only higher end devices have. And then finally, my fifth con for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G is that it doesn't have a telephoto lens. Now earlier in the video, I talked about how this camera, despite being really good, is still not perfect, and this is pretty much the only drawback I could think of. So on one hand, it has pretty much all the features you typically find in a mid-range phone, like an ultra-wide camera, macro camera, even 4K video recording, but unfortunately, it still doesn't have a telephoto lens, so for longer distance photos, you will still have to rely on digital zoom. To be fair, it's not really that bad on this phone, but at the same time, a telephoto lens does make a huge difference. It's not like only flagship phones have this feature. I mean, the Samsung Galaxy A72 5G, for example, that came out a couple years ago, that phone had a telephoto lens. So I know there are mid-range phones that do have that feature, but in general, to be fair, it's really not very common. Definitely more of a feature for higher end devices. But if you are taking lots of longer distance photos, maybe you're a bit more into mobile photography, in that case, you might want to spend a bit more money and get something like a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE, for example, that does actually have a telephoto lens. But those were my pros and cons for the Samsung Galaxy A34 5G. In general, as you could probably tell, the pros honestly with this phone really outweigh the cons. And for what it is, if you're looking for an affordable 5G phone that has really good performance, a nice display, a great camera, and plenty of features for daily use, then this phone is definitely worth considering. Now once again, if you do want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.